dead. He went south yesterday. He ain't dead.
Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, has finally spoken out about the tragic passing of his longtime friend and collaborator, Gene Hackman. The two icons shared decades of history in Hollywood, and Eastwood's words serve as both a tribute and a reflection on their unforgettable experiences together. Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman were two towering figures in Hollywood, their careers running side by side for decades. Though they carved their own paths, their journeys were intertwined in ways that shaped not only their individual legacies but the entire film industry. They weren't just actors, they were forces of nature, men who redefined what it meant to be a leading man. Their presence on screen was magnetic, gritty, raw, and utterly compelling. Eastwood, with his quiet intensity and signature squint, became the embodiment of the American tough guy. Hackman, equally formidable, was a master of versatility, capable of portraying men of deep conviction, ruthless authority, or quiet desperation. Their careers took off in the late 60s and 70s, a time when Hollywood was shifting from the polished glamour of old to something more real, more visceral. They weren't just part of that transformation, they were leading it. Despite their separate rises to fame, the two men found themselves walking the same roads, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals. They shared an unspoken understanding. Both came from working-class backgrounds, both had spent time in the military, and both had clawed their way to the top through sheer determination. They didn't have the privilege of instant stardom, they had to fight for every role, every opportunity. Off-screen, they were known for their no-nonsense attitudes, men who didn't indulge in the vanity of Hollywood. They weren't the type to play into the celebrity spectacle, instead, they let their work do the talking. Eastwood, famously a man of few words, carried that same demeanor into his directing. Hackman, though more openly expressive, was equally uninterested in the artificiality of fame. They had a mutual respect for each other's craft, recognizing in each other a dedication that few in the industry could match. Both men shared a love for authenticity. When they stepped into a role, they weren't just performing, they were living it. Whether it was Eastwood's hardened gunslingers or Hackman's deeply layered lawmen, their characters never felt like caricatures. They were real, flawed, dangerous, and compelling. That was what set them apart in an industry often obsessed with polish and perfection. Their careers intersected at key moments, sometimes in direct collaboration, sometimes in indirect competition. While Eastwood was making his mark in spaghetti westerns, Hackman was carving out a space in crime dramas and thrillers. When one dominated the box office, the other wasn't far behind with a critically acclaimed performance. They weren't just contemporaries, they were benchmarks for one another, constant reminders of the level of excellence required to stay at the top. Their friendship wasn't one that played out in front of cameras or on red carpets. It was quieter, built on admiration and professional respect. They didn't need to broadcast their bond, they understood each other without words. They were men of action, not spectacle, that was their way. As the years passed, their paths would continue to cross in unexpected ways, culminating in a project that would become one of the greatest westerns ever made, a film that would bring their careers full circle, cementing their legacies not just as icons but as storytellers who shaped the very foundation of modern cinema. Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman first crossed paths in the heart of Hollywood's golden era, two men who had risen from humble beginnings to stand among the greats. Neither had the luxury of an easy start. Both had spent years grinding through small roles, struggling to break into an industry that didn't hand out success lightly. But when they met, there was an instant recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that they were cut from the same cloth. Eastwood had carved out his place through the tough, sun-scorched landscapes of spaghetti westerns, perfecting the role of the silent, deadly gunslinger. He became the man with no name, an icon of cold-blooded efficiency. Meanwhile, Hackman was making his mark in character-driven drama, where his performances brought depth, humanity, and often an edge of raw intensity. They were traveling different roads, but both were redefining what it meant to be a leading man in a changing Hollywood. Despite their differences in style and genre, their approach to acting was eerily similar. Both had a workmanlike mentality, treating their craft with the same discipline they had developed during their time in the military. Eastwood had served in the Army, Hackman in the Marine Corps. Two branches, two paths, but the same foundation of discipline and resilience. That military background wasn't just a footnote in their lives, it shaped how they moved through the world, how they approached every role with focus and precision. Hollywood was undergoing a transformation. The old, clean-cut heroes of the silver screen were fading, making room for something more complex, more flawed, more real. Eastwood and Hackman were at the forefront of that shift. They weren't the polished, untouchable idols of the past. They were men who carried grit in their performances, who brought a lived-in authenticity that resonated with audiences. Their characters had shades of gray, men who could be heroes in one moment and villains in the next. There was a quiet respect between them from the very beginning. Neither was the type to engage in Hollywood's superficial pleasantries, and neither was interested in the endless politics of the industry. They simply admired each other's work. Eastwood saw in Hackman an actor who could disappear into any role, who could make even the smallest moments feel electric. Hackman, in turn, recognized Eastwood's ability to say more with a look than most actors could with an entire monologue. They moved in the same circles, crossed paths at industry events, and occasionally found themselves auditioning for the same roles. There was never open rivalry. If anything, it was an unspoken challenge to keep pushing themselves, to never settle for anything less than excellence. They knew that audiences could see through the artificial, and neither man had any interest in delivering anything but the real thing. As the years went on, their respect only deepened. Even though they weren't always on the same projects, they watched each other's careers unfold with admiration. They knew that sooner or later, their paths would cross in a way that would leave an undeniable mark on film history. And when it finally happened, it would be more than just another film, it would be a moment where two legends came together to create something unforgettable. 1992 marked a defining moment in Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman's shared history. Unforgiven wasn't just another Western. It was a deconstruction of everything the genre had built over decades. It was a film about violence, morality, and the inevitable reckoning that comes for every man. And at the center of it were two titans of the screen, playing characters destined for a final, bloody collision. Eastwood, both behind and in front of the camera, had one man in mind for the role of Sheriff Little Bill Daggett, Gene Hackman. There was no second choice. Hackman was the only actor. Eastwood believed he could bring the character to life with the weight and complexity it needed. He knew Hackman had the presence, the quiet menace, and the depth to make Unforgiven more than just a shootout between good and evil. In this world, there were no true heroes, no clear-cut villains, only men trying to survive the choices they'd made. When Hackman first read the script, he hesitated. The film was violent, brutally so, and he wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of something that seemed to glorify that world. But Eastwood saw Unforgiven differently. He explained that this wasn't a story about fearless gunfighters or noble sheriffs, it was a story about the weight of violence, about men who had spent their lives killing and could no longer outrun their pasts. Hackman understood, and he signed on, knowing that this role would be something special. On set, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had worked with some of the best actors in the business, but this film was different. It was raw, stripped down, the kind of story that required absolute trust between director and cast. Eastwood and Hackman had that trust. They didn't need long discussions about motivation or character arcs, they simply knew. Their dynamic on screen was electric. Eastwood's William Money was a man who had tried to bury his past, to leave behind the killing that had defined him. Hackman's Little Bill was a lawman who believed he was the only thing standing between order and chaos. But he wasn't the noble sheriff of old westerns, he was cruel, violent, and utterly convinced that his way was the only way. Every moment they shared on screen crackled with tension, a slow-burning confrontation that felt inevitable from the start. What made Hackman's performance so unforgettable was the humanity he brought to Little Bill. He wasn't a mindless villain, he had a sense of humor, a code he believed in, and a genuine desire to keep his town safe. But in doing so, he became just as brutal as the outlaws he fought against. That was Hackman's brilliance, he could make you despise a character and yet understand them at the same time. Eastwood watched Hackman work with admiration. He had always known he was one of the best, but Unforgiven cemented it. Hackman delivered a performance so layered, so powerful, that it earned him an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. It was a moment of recognition not just for one great performance but for an entire career of excellence. For Eastwood, Unforgiven was personal. It was his farewell to the gunslinger archetype, his way of closing the book on the kind of characters that had made him famous. And there was no one he would have rather shared that story with than Hackman. They had spent their careers shaping the modern Western, and with Unforgiven, they gave it one last unforgettable chapter. Even decades later, Eastwood would call Unforgiven one of the most important films of his career. And when he spoke about it, he never failed to mention Hackman. Because for all the grit, all the bloodshed, and all the cinematic history they made together, the heart of Unforgiven was their shared understanding of what made a story truly great, real, flawed, unforgettable characters played by men who understood them better than anyone else ever could. After Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman rarely shared the screen again, but their connection never faded. It wasn't built on public appearances or Hollywood events, it was deeper than that. It was a bond forged in respect, in the quiet acknowledgement that they were two of the last of their kind. They had both come up in an era where hard work was everything. They didn't rely on gimmicks or publicity stunts. They weren't interested in the politics of Hollywood or chasing trends. They came to set, did their jobs, and let the work speak for itself. It was an old-school mentality, the kind that separated legends from those who just passed through the industry. They didn't waste time with endless takes or overanalyzing performances. They trusted their instincts. They trusted the story. That trust in their craft created an unspoken rivalry, one not built on competition, but on a mutual drive to keep going, to keep pushing the limits of what they could do. For decades, they had watched each other rise, fall, and rise again. They weren't chasing awards or box office records. They were chasing longevity. It wasn't about being the best in the moment, it was about seeing who could keep going the longest, who could keep delivering performances that meant something. For Hackman, that journey came to an end in 2004. After a career spanning more than 4 decades, he quietly stepped away from acting. There was no grand farewell tour, no dramatic exit, just a decision to move on. He had done it all. He had played every kind of role, won every major award, and left behind a filmography that spoke for itself. Eastwood, however, wasn't ready to stop. Acting was in his blood, but directing had become his true passion. While Hackman found peace in retirement, Eastwood kept working, kept telling stories. He pushed forward, defying expectations, proving that age was just another challenge to overcome. Hackman's retirement surprised a lot of people, Eastwood included. It was rare for someone at the top of their game to walk away so definitively. But Hackman never second-guessed his decision. He had other interests, writing, painting, living life beyond the camera. For him, acting had been a chapter, not the whole story. Eastwood, on the other hand, couldn't imagine stepping away. His love for filmmaking never faded, and as long as he had a story to tell, he would keep going. That was their difference. Hackman had given Hollywood everything he had and was content to leave it behind. Eastwood saw no finish line, no reason to stop as long as he could still bring something to the screen. Despite taking different paths, their respect for each other never wavered. They remained two sides of the same coin, men who had shaped Hollywood, who had built careers on talent and tenacity, who had nothing left to prove but continued to define their own legacies. Even though they no longer worked together, there was always the question, what if? What if they had reunited for one last film, one final story? But in a way, Unforgiven had already given them that. It was their definitive statement, their shared masterpiece. And so, their friendly rivalry lived on, not in competition, but in the knowledge that they had both done what so few ever could. They had stood the test of time. Clint Eastwood has always been a man of few words, but when the news of Gene Hackman's passing reached him, those who knew him could see the weight of it in his eyes. It wasn't just the loss of a fellow actor, it was the loss of one of the last remaining giants of his era. The two had come up together, shaped the industry together, and now one of them was gone. In a rare public statement, Eastwood didn't hold back his admiration. He called Hackman one of the best to ever do it, a man whose presence on screen was never just about playing a role, it was about elevating everything around him. Every film, every scene, every line felt sharper, more alive when Hackman was in it. He didn't just act, he transformed. Eastwood spoke about Unforgiven with particular pride. That film wasn't just another project for either of them, it was a defining moment. It was about legacy, about closing a chapter on the Western myth they had both helped build. And it was a film where Eastwood had seen Hackman at his very best. In his words, Unforgiven was one of the proudest moments of his career, not just because of what it meant for him, but because of what Hackman brought to it. But Hackman's impact wasn't limited to the roles he played. Eastwood reflected on the man beyond the screen, the one who had a deep love for history, for storytelling in all forms. After stepping away from acting, Hackman turned to writing, crafting novels with the same depth and attention to detail that made him such a compelling actor. He was a quiet force in Hollywood, never chasing the spotlight, never indulging in the excesses of fame. He did the work and then walked away on his own terms. That, Eastwood said, was something he always respected. Their last conversations had been reflective, two men who had seen it all, looking back at the industry they had helped shape. They had watched Hollywood change, watched the old ways fade and new faces take over. But through it all, their bond remained, silent but unshakable. Now, with Hackman gone, Eastwood found himself looking around and realizing how few remained. The generation of actors who had built Hollywood into what it was, men who didn't just act but embodied a different kind of artistry, was disappearing. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. Still, Eastwood knew one thing for certain, Hackman's legacy wasn't just in the films he left behind. It was in the way he approached his craft, the way he never settled for anything less than great. It was in the countless performances that would continue to inspire long after the man himself was gone. For Clint Eastwood, the world of cinema had lost one of its true legends. But legends don't fade, not really. As long as people continued to watch Unforgiven, The French Connection, and every other masterpiece Hackman had touched, he would always be there, gritty, unforgettable, and as real as they come. With Gene Hackman's passing, another chapter of classic Hollywood closes. The men who built the industry through grit, talent, and relentless work ethic are becoming fewer with each passing year. The golden era of tough, uncompromising actors, those who didn't rely on spectacle but on sheer presence, is fading into history. Clint Eastwood has seen this happen before. He's watched friends, co-stars, and contemporaries leave one by one. He knows it's inevitable. But that doesn't make it any easier. Hackman wasn't just another name in the credits. He was part of something bigger, a generation of actors who didn't just play characters but embodied them. They weren't concerned with fame or accolades. They cared about the work. They cared about telling stories that mattered. Eastwood understands that the industry has changed, the way films are made, the way performances are shaped. It's a different world now. But Hackman's legacy, like that of the greats before him, isn't tied to trends or fleeting moments of recognition. It's carved into the foundation of cinema itself. His performances aren't relics of the past, they're masterclasses in storytelling, lessons for anyone who wants to understand what true acting looks like. Even now, Eastwood can still hear Hackman's voice, still picture him on set, delivering lines with that unmistakable conviction. He thinks back to Unforgiven, to the weight of that story, to the final words exchanged between their characters. And he knows there's no better way to sum it all up than with one simple line: "We all got it coming, kid." It's a reminder that time waits for no one, that every legend, every story, every life eventually reaches its final page. But Hackman's work, his influence, his impact won't disappear. As long as people keep watching, keep learning from what he left behind, he'll never truly be gone. For Clint Eastwood, it's not just the loss of a friend or a co-star. It's the closing of a book that took decades to write, a book filled with performances that defined a generation, with films that shaped the very language of cinema. And now, all that remains is the legacy, the work, the moments frozen on screen, reminding the world of the kind of actor, the kind of storyteller, the kind of man that Gene Hackman was. And that will last forever. Clint Eastwood's tribute to Gene Hackman isn't just a goodbye. It's a reflection on an era that's slipping away, a time when actors weren't just entertainers but craftsmen who shaped the very foundation of cinema. They didn't rely on technology, franchises, or spectacle to leave their mark. They built their legacies through talent, discipline, and a relentless dedication to the art of storytelling. Hackman was one of the last of that breed, an actor who didn't just play a role but became it, who never sought the spotlight but commanded it effortlessly. His performances weren't designed to impress, they were built to last. Every character he played, every scene he delivered carried a depth and authenticity that made his work timeless. Now, with his passing, Eastwood is left looking back at a Hollywood that barely resembles the one they helped build. The industry moves forward, as it always does. But some things can't be replaced. Legends like Hackman don't just disappear. They leave behind stories, performances, and lessons that will inspire for generations. Hackman may be gone, but his presence remains. It's in the films that continue to be studied, in the performances that actors still aspire to, in the quiet, powerful moments that defined his career. And as long as there are people who care about great storytelling, his work will never fade. Clint Eastwood knows this better than anyone. Because he, too, has spent his life proving that stories are what endure. And just like Hackman, his legacy will stand the test of time.